The orphanage closed in one night, and the town was given a single sentence to accept it. No hearings, no lists, no goodbyes. Decades later, a forgotten box surfaces, stuffed with mismatched names, crossed-out entries, missing dates, and files that don't align with anyone's memory. Former staff and grown survivors start pulling threads, and every page raises the same question. If the records were altered, what else was erased? The building still stands, windows sealed with dust, gates eaten by rust, and silence where routines once ran. Somewhere inside the paperwork, the last days were rewritten. Children moved, accounts shifted, and entire lives removed as if they never existed. The orphanage was once a place of refuge. A sanctuary for children abandoned by society, those who had nowhere else to go. It stood proudly in the heart of a small town, nestled between the whispering trees and the sleepy lanes that wound their way through the village. In its prime, the orphanage was a beacon of hope, offering warmth, food, and the kind of stability that many of the children had never known. Its gates were always open, and its halls echoed with the sound of children's laughter and the soft shuffle of staff tending to their needs. But that was before the day it all came to a shocking, sudden halt. One fateful evening, a wave of confusion and fear swept through the orphanage, leaving a once bustling institution eerily silent. The children, who had called it home for as long as they could remember, were hurriedly removed, sent to various institutions, foster homes, or in some cases, left to fend for themselves. The staff, who had spent their lives looking after these children, were sent packing, dismissed without a word of explanation. No one seemed to have any answers. The community, which had always regarded the orphanage as a pillar of the town, was left reeling in disbelief. Why had it closed so suddenly? What had happened behind those walls? And most importantly, where had all the children gone? The official explanation was nothing more than a vague statement, a simple line saying that the orphanage had closed due to unforeseen circumstances. But that didn't sit right with anyone. There were rumors. Whispers that something darker had been at play, something that no one was willing to discuss. Some claimed it was financial problems, others suggested mismanagement, but none of these explanations seemed to cover the real depth of the mystery. In the years that followed, the building stood vacant, its once vibrant walls now faded and worn. Local residents occasionally walked past, casting curious glances at the abandoned structure. There was an unspoken fear surrounding it, a sense that something sinister lurked within its crumbling walls. No one dared to venture inside, and over time, the memory of the orphanage slowly faded from the town's collective consciousness. But for some, the questions remained. What had really happened? Why did the orphanage close so suddenly? And where were the children? It wasn't until decades later that the truth began to slowly emerge, hidden in the most unexpected of places. It was a dusty attic in a forgotten corner of the town's local library where the first clue was discovered. A box, marked with the faint imprint of the orphanage's name, was tucked away beneath a pile of other neglected records. It was the kind of box that most people would have overlooked. It was unassuming, plain, and filled with brittle files that had yellowed with age. But inside that box were the remnants of a dark history, an archive of secrets, lies, and events that had been buried for far too long. When the box was first opened, no one knew the weight of the truth it would carry. The records were shockingly disorganized, filled with cryptic notes, names that didn't match, and details that seemed incomplete. Yet, as those who began to comb through them started to piece together the scattered fragments, a chilling picture began to form. The story of the orphanage, it seemed, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The names of children who had never been sent to new homes. Records of strange disappearances. Accounts of individuals who had worked there, but whose names had been crossed out or altered. There were whispers in the pages, notes about meetings held behind closed doors, conversations that were never meant to be overheard. And there were more troubling records, vague references to people who had been removed from the list entirely, as though they had never existed. The deeper the investigation into these records went, the more unsettling it became. But there were still so many questions. Who were the people behind the orphanage's closure? Why had they been so quick to erase any trace of the children who had lived there? And most chilling of all, what had really happened in those final, chaotic days before the doors were shut forever? As the investigation unfolded, former staff members who had once worked at the orphanage began to come forward. Some spoke willingly, eager to share what they knew, while others hesitated, afraid of what might happen if they spoke too loudly. There was one former caregiver, a woman who had worked there for years, who recalled the moment the doors had been locked for the last time. She described the eerie silence that had fallen over the building, the hurried rush to remove the children, and the unexplainable sense of dread that seemed to fill the air. It was like they knew something was coming, she said, her voice trembling as she recalled the events. The children were scared. Some of them had already heard the rumors. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew something wasn't right. And the staff, none of us were given a reason. We were told to pack up and leave. It felt wrong. Another former staff member, who had been a caretaker for one of the younger children, revealed that she had overheard something disturbing in the days leading up to the closure. She hadn't understood the full extent of it at the time, but now, looking back, the pieces were starting to fit together. There were strange meetings, staff members I'd never seen before coming in, talking in hushed tones. They didn't want anyone else to know what was going on. It was like they were trying to hide something big. But it wasn't just the staff members who had questions. There were also a few of the children who had grown up in the orphanage and, as adults, began to search for answers. One of them, a man now in his late 40s, had been only 7 years old when the orphanage was shut down. He still remembered the day the doors closed, the confusion in his own mind as the adults scrambled to explain what was happening. "I was so young, but I remember feeling like something was wrong," he said. "One day we were told everything was fine, and the next, poof, it was all gone. Just like that. I don't even remember what happened to the kids I used to play with. Where did they go? Why did they take us away like that?" The survivor had spent years trying to trace the other children, but the records were incomplete, and the memories were too fragmented. His search was in vain. No one had any answers. But he wasn't alone. Others from his generation, the ones who had lived in the orphanage, also felt that same haunting absence. They all remembered the suddenness, the confusion, and the chilling sense that something was being hidden. And then, one by one, more people began to ask the same questions. What had really happened to the children who vanished that day? Why were there so many inconsistencies in the records? Why had the truth been buried for so long? As the investigation continued, the questions grew more pressing, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. But with each new discovery came more uncertainty. The story of the orphanage, it seemed, was far from over. The records, once thought to be the final word on the mystery, only raised more questions. The answers were still out there, but someone, it seemed, had gone to great lengths to make sure they stayed hidden. The question remained, what had happened in that orphanage all those years ago, and why had it been covered up for so long? The deeper the investigation went, the darker the story became. And the more it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated case, it was part of something much bigger, something more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. The orphanage had stood for nearly 50 years before its sudden closure, a fixture in the town that everyone had simply accepted as part of the landscape. It wasn't just a place for children, it was an institution, a symbol of the town's commitment to the welfare of the most vulnerable. Many had grown up hearing about the orphanage, its founding, and the good work it had done over the years. In fact, for most, it was hard to imagine the town without it. The story of the orphanage began decades earlier, during a time when child welfare was an issue many towns struggled to address. The founders, a group of local philanthropists and religious figures, had seen a need and responded to it, opening the doors of the institution with the hope of providing a safe haven for children who had been abandoned, orphaned, or neglected. The town had welcomed the idea. After all, it was common knowledge that children who had no one else to turn to often ended up in worse situations. The orphanage, for all its imperfections, was seen as a better alternative. For years, it was regarded as a model institution, praised for its ability to care for the children, feed them, provide schooling, and create a semblance of family life for those who had lost everything. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect solution to a problem that had plagued society for generations. People saw the orphanage as a place of hope, even though, like most places, it had its issues. The children were given shelter and education, but it was clear to anyone who took a closer look that life inside wasn't always as perfect as the public image suggested. There were whispers, of course. Whispers about the way some children seemed to disappear for weeks on end, only to return later, quiet and withdrawn. There were rumors about certain staff members, whose behavior toward the children was described as less than nurturing. But these were just whispers, easily dismissed by those who wanted to believe in the idea of a perfect institution. Over the years, the orphanage became a part of the town's identity. The staff, many of whom had worked there for decades, became familiar faces in the community. The building itself, though a bit worn, still held an air of authority. It was solid, dependable, and unyielding. And most people, even those who had no personal connection to the children inside, thought of the orphanage as a necessary good in a world that often lacked compassion for the vulnerable. But, as with many institutions that operate under the radar, cracks began to show. It wasn't immediately apparent, but those cracks began to widen over time. The staff changed. Some left for other jobs, others were replaced, but a few remained constant. Among those who had worked there for many years, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air as the years passed. The whispers began to grow louder. Some staff members who had once been trusted pillars of the institution started to notice things that didn't sit right. Documents went missing, children were moved from one place to another with little explanation, and there were strange, unexplained absences from the facility. It was as if something was shifting behind the scenes, something that no one was talking about but that everyone felt. The tension became especially noticeable in the months leading up to the closure. A sense of foreboding hung over the orphanage. Staff members reported feeling like they were being watched, and there was a growing feeling that the institution was under pressure, though from what, no one was sure. The children, for the first time in years, seemed to sense it too. They were uneasy, their behavior growing erratic. Some of them talked in hushed tones about strange occurrences, things that had happened behind closed doors, things that no one else was supposed to know. It wasn't clear what they were referring to, but the air was thick with a kind of dread that hadn't been there before. Then, of course, there were the parents of the children, the ones who had been told that their kids would be cared for and protected. A handful of them began to notice that their children, when they returned home after visits or breaks, weren't the same. They were quieter, withdrawn, and some were even visibly afraid of certain staff members. It wasn't just the children who were starting to feel the weight of something ominous. The parents, too, began to question the institution they had once trusted so completely. Despite these growing concerns, nothing was done. The authorities in town seemed content to let the orphanage continue operating, as long as there were no major complaints. And for years the orphanage had remained a safe place. At least that's what everyone wanted to believe. But in the final months before its closure, things began to deteriorate rapidly. It was clear to anyone paying attention that there were problems, but no one knew how deep those problems went. When the closure was finally announced, it was done with little warning. The children were taken out of the building, some with little more than the clothes on their backs, and sent to various new homes, foster care, or other institutions. The staff, who had been part of the orphanage for years, were told to pack up their things and leave. No explanation was given. No farewell. It was as though the orphanage had never existed at all. The town was left stunned. People who had grown up with the institution were shocked. How could this happen? Why was it closed? Where were the children? What had really been going on behind those closed doors? For the first time, the residents of the town began to ask questions. But by then, the building had been emptied. The children had vanished, the staff had disappeared, and the community was left with nothing but unanswered questions. The official statement was that the orphanage was closing due to financial difficulties, but that explanation didn't sit right with anyone who had followed the orphanage's history. The money had never been a problem in the past. There were enough benefactors, enough local support to keep it going. So why all of a sudden had it been shut down so abruptly? The days following the closure were filled with confusion and fear. The town tried to carry on, but the absence of the orphanage left a void. It was as though a part of the town's very identity had been erased. People started to dig into the past, trying to uncover the reasons behind the closure, but no one was able to find any answers. The town was left with nothing more than rumors and gossip. Some believed that there had been a scandal, something too dark to be made public. Others speculated that the orphanage had been involved in something much more sinister. But all of these theories were just that, speculation. For years the building sat abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. The children who had once filled the halls were gone, and the town moved on, leaving the orphanage to rot in silence. But even as time passed, the questions didn't go away. They lingered, unspoken but present in the air. What had really happened at the orphanage? What secrets had been hidden there, buried deep within its walls? And why, after all these years, was no one willing to talk about it? It wasn't until decades later, when the records of the orphanage were unearthed by chance, that the town would finally begin to get some answers. The documents, which had been sealed away for so long, held the key to uncovering the truth, if only someone could make sense of the chaotic and cryptic notes within them. But even as the records began to emerge, the mystery only deepened. The more the investigators dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. It was clear now that the story of the orphanage was far darker than anyone could have imagined. And the answers, when they finally came, would shake the town to its very core. The years following the sudden closure of the orphanage were filled with a kind of haunting silence. The building itself stood like a relic of a past that no one wanted to confront, its walls now crumbling, its windows darkened with dust. The community, once shaken by the abruptness of the closure, gradually moved on. Life returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be in a town that had once been home to so many lost children. But even as the town settled back into its routines, the shadow of the orphanage lingered in the background, a lingering question mark in the collective consciousness of its residents. No one had really discussed the orphanage for years, not openly. There were occasional whispers, of course, rumors about what had happened, half-formed speculations that hinted at something dark behind the scenes. But for the most part, people had resigned themselves to the idea that the orphanage had simply closed down because of financial issues, or perhaps due to some bureaucratic failure. The authorities had been content to leave it at that. There had been no official investigation, no public inquiry, and no one had bothered to ask the hard questions. After all, the town had other things to worry about. The orphanage was a thing of the past, and like most things that were too uncomfortable to confront, it was better left forgotten. But the questions didn't go away. They festered in the minds of a few, quietly eating away at the fabric of the town's tranquility. Some of the children who had grown up in the orphanage, now adults, couldn't shake the memory of that day. The day the doors had closed for the last time. The day they were told to leave as if they had never mattered. As if they were no more than a fleeting inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. Where had they gone? Why had they been sent away so abruptly? And why, in all the years since, had no one ever explained what had really happened? There was one survivor, now in his 40s, who had never been able to put the past behind him. He had been just 7 years old when the orphanage was shut down. A child who had come to rely on the institution as a surrogate family, only to be tossed aside without warning. His memory of that day was vivid. He could still see the faces of the staff, their hurried movements, the confusion and fear in their eyes. He had asked questions, of course, but the answers had always been vague, evasive. No one had told him the truth. No one had explained why the orphanage, which had been his home, was suddenly no longer there. For years he had tried to forget, to move on with his life. But the unanswered questions had always lingered in the back of his mind, like a haunting echo that wouldn't fade. He had tried to find the other children who had been there with him, but it was as if they had all vanished without a trace. The orphanage had closed, and they had been scattered to the wind, each one going in a different direction. Some were sent to foster homes, others were adopted, and a few simply disappeared. The survivors had become strangers to one another, their bonds severed by time and distance. But this survivor, let's call him John, couldn't stop thinking about it. The uncertainty. The unanswered questions. The feeling that something had been hidden from him, from all of them. He wasn't the only one. There were others too, people who had grown up in the orphanage who had the same questions, the same unresolved grief. They too had tried to forget, but they couldn't. There was something in their past that refused to be ignored. It was by chance that John stumbled upon the first clue. It had been years since he had given the orphanage much thought. He had moved away, built a life for himself, and tried to bury the past. But one afternoon, while browsing through old records at the local library, something caught his eye. A box. An unmarked box, wedged behind other forgotten files. There was no reason for him to look through it, no reason to think it would have anything to do with his past. But something compelled him to open it. Inside were the orphanage's old records, old documents that had been sealed away, buried beneath layers of dust and time. At first glance, they appeared to be a mishmash of paperwork, lists of names, schedules, mundane notes about the daily running of the orphanage. But as John flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. There were names. Names that he recognized. Names of children who had been there when he was. And next to those names were dates. Dates that didn't make sense, dates when children had been moved but never accounted for. It didn't take long for him to realize that something was wrong. The records didn't add up. There were gaps, inconsistencies, and odd notations that suggested something had been covered up. He couldn't help himself, he needed to know more. The questions that had plagued him for so many years surged to the surface. Why had the orphanage been shut down so suddenly? Where had the children gone? What had happened to those who disappeared from the records? He couldn't let it go. The discovery of the records was the spark that reignited his search for answers. And this time he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. But as John began to dig deeper, he realized that the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the search became. The documents were cryptic, and the more he read, the more he realized that the truth was not going to be easy to find. There were hints, vague references to meetings behind closed doors, references to people who were erased from the records entirely. The deeper he went, the more the puzzle pieces refused to fit together. And with each new discovery, the fear began to set in. This was no ordinary investigation. There was something much darker at play, something that had been hidden from public view for decades. And the deeper John went, the more he felt the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. He wasn't alone in his quest. Other former residents of the orphanage, now scattered across the country, had begun to search for answers of their own. Some had already attempted to reach out to the authorities, to find out what had happened to the children who had vanished, but their attempts had been met with stonewalling, indifference, and outright hostility. No one seemed to care. The records had been sealed away for a reason, and it wasn't just bureaucracy at play. There was something more, something sinister, that no one wanted to acknowledge. As John pressed on, the fear grew. He began to question whether he was even safe in his pursuit of the truth. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that there were people who would go to great lengths to keep this story buried. People who didn't want the past to come to light. People who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And as John dug deeper into the orphanage's history, he began to realize that the closure of the institution was just the beginning of a much darker story. But John wasn't ready to stop. He had to know what had really happened. He had to understand why the orphanage had been shut down so abruptly, and why the children who had lived there had been swept away without a trace. The more he learned, the more he realized that the answers were far more disturbing than he could have ever imagined. And with each new piece of the puzzle that fell into place, John began to feel a growing sense of dread. What had he stumbled into? And how far would he be willing to go to uncover the truth, even if it meant uncovering something far darker than he had ever expected? The years that followed the orphanage's closure felt like a long, drawn-out period of unspoken tension. Life in the town had largely returned to its regular rhythms, but the shadow of the orphanage still hung over everything. It wasn't something that could be forgotten so easily. There was an unsettling quality to the town now, as if the collective memory of the orphanage had been buried beneath layers of time, but the weight of it was still present, pushing at the edges of daily life. For many people, especially those who had been directly involved with the orphanage, it was impossible to ignore the gnawing feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The children who had been there, the ones who had been hastily moved to other homes, were gone, but not forgotten. Their faces haunted the minds of former staff members, their absence a constant reminder of a chapter left unfinished. There were whispers among those who had worked there, hints of conversations that never fully materialized, of things they had seen but didn't dare speak about. One of the former staff members, a woman named Caroline, had been a caregiver at the orphanage for over a decade. She had seen the children grow up, watched them leave one by one, and had spent years trying to forget the events surrounding the closure. But like many others, the memories of that time had never quite faded. She tried to bury them, but it was always there, beneath the surface, a quiet unease that she couldn't shake. It had been a few years after the closure when she first started to notice things that didn't make sense. Small things at first, people acting strange, a sense of secrecy hanging around the old building. Then it became more pronounced. Caroline started hearing rumors about the orphanage, things she had never known before. Whispers of missing children, of disappearances that hadn't been explained, of dark figures connected to the institution. These rumors weren't new, but now they seemed more urgent, more real. For years she had tried to push all of it out of her mind, but it wasn't working anymore. She found herself returning to the orphanage's old grounds, even though she hadn't stepped foot on the property in years. The gates were rusted, and the once pristine garden had been overtaken by weeds. But there was something magnetic about the place, something that kept pulling her back. It was almost as if the building itself was calling to her, urging her to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. One afternoon, as Caroline walked past the iron gates, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, tucked in the corner of the property, was a pile of old records, forgotten paperwork, abandoned and left to rot in the elements. It was a strange sight, almost as if someone had deliberately discarded them. She couldn't resist. She picked up the pile, the papers brittle with age, and began flipping through them. At first glance, the documents appeared to be mundane. Lists of children, records of their stay at the orphanage, details of their care. But then she saw something that stopped her cold. One page tucked at the back was different. It was a list of names, but these names didn't match the children who had been there. The dates were off, the entries didn't add up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there were strange notations next to certain names. Names that, when Caroline checked, didn't appear anywhere else in the records. The more she read, the more she realized that something had been hidden, something important. Her heart raced as she turned the pages. It didn't take long for her to find more inconsistencies, names that had been crossed out, dates that didn't make sense, references to children who had vanished without explanation. It was clear now that the records were not just poorly kept, they were deliberately altered. There was something wrong with the way these documents had been handled. Someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the truth. Caroline's mind raced as she pieced together what she had found. She had worked at the orphanage for years, but there were things she had never known, things that had been kept hidden from the staff, from the public. Now, as she looked at these records, the fragments of her memories began to fall into place. She remembered the hushed conversations between certain staff members, the odd disappearances, the children who were moved from one place to another without explanation. The children were the ones who had suffered the most, of course. Their lives had been disrupted, their futures uncertain. But Caroline also realized that she, too, had been a part of something dark. She had been complicit, even if she hadn't understood the full extent of it. She had seen the signs, felt the tension in the air, but had never questioned it, never dared to ask the difficult questions. She had trusted that someone else was watching over things, that someone else was in control. But now, standing in the overgrown yard of the orphanage with the abandoned records in her hands, she knew better. Something had happened, something terrible, and it had been covered up. There were people who had been involved, people who had a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. She had been part of that system, unknowingly playing her role in the charade that had concealed the orphanage's darkest secrets. Caroline knew she had to do something. She couldn't just walk away and pretend she hadn't seen the evidence staring her in the face. But where could she go for answers? Who could she trust? The authorities who had closed the orphanage so abruptly were the same ones who had failed to investigate the strange circumstances surrounding its closure. And even if she did bring these records to light, would anyone believe her? Would anyone care? The town had moved on, and most people were content to let the past stay buried. The truth, it seemed, had no place in the present. As Caroline pondered her next steps, another former staff member reached out to her. A man named Peter who had worked at the orphanage for a short time before the closure. Peter had always been a quiet, reserved man, but Caroline had always trusted him. When he called her one evening, his voice was shaky, almost fearful. He had seen something too. He had stumbled upon something that had made him question everything he thought he knew about the orphanage. They met in secret, far away from the prying eyes of the town. Peter had found more records, more documents that painted a picture of a cover-up much larger than either of them had ever imagined. The records weren't just disorganized, they were intentionally manipulated, their contents hidden from everyone, including the staff who had worked there. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that the closure of the orphanage had been part of a much larger conspiracy. A conspiracy that involved powerful figures, people who had the resources and the influence to make the truth disappear. But what was the truth? What had really happened to the children? Where had they gone? Were they alive? Had they been taken elsewhere? Or had something darker occurred? The questions were endless, and each answer seemed to raise more. Caroline and Peter, along with a few other former staff members, decided to press on. They began to investigate the connections between the orphanage and the local government, searching for clues that would lead them to the answers they so desperately sought. But the further they dug, the more dangerous their search became. Someone didn't want them asking questions, didn't want them uncovering the truth. They began receiving threats, subtle at first, then more direct. They were being watched. Their every move was being monitored. Despite the danger, Caroline couldn't stop. The guilt, the overwhelming feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, kept pushing her forward. She knew they were getting close, that they were on the verge of discovering something that could change everything. But she also knew that they were running out of time. The people behind the cover-up weren't going to let them expose the truth without a fight. As the investigation progressed, the group found more disturbing evidence. Documents that had been hidden for years. Whistleblower testimonies that had been silenced. And, most chilling of all, names. The names of children who had disappeared without a trace, whose fates had been deliberately erased from history. These children weren't just forgotten. They had been wiped from existence. Now, Caroline and Peter were left with one final question. What had happened to the children? Where were they? And why had their stories been stolen from them? The answers were within reach, but they were shrouded in darkness. Darkness that was determined to stay hidden. And with every answer they uncovered, they found themselves sinking deeper into a mystery that was far darker, far more sinister, than they could have ever imagined. The years of silence had left a deep wound in the community, but the discovery of the orphanage's long-hidden records set the stage for a dramatic and unsettling unraveling. The moment Caroline and Peter began combing through the documents, it became clear that the orphanage's story was far from ordinary. These weren't just records of an institution that had failed its children or a place that had quietly closed its doors due to financial troubles. No, these documents were pieces of a larger, more disturbing puzzle, one that had been carefully hidden for decades. As Caroline pored over the files, she began to uncover something she had never expected: a network of names. Names that belonged to children who had been sent to other homes, but without clear documentation. Children whose fates were left to drift into obscurity. There were also names that didn't match the records, lists of people who had no apparent connection to the orphanage, and strange, incomplete entries. The more she read, the more she felt a gnawing unease deep in her chest. The orphanage had been far more than a simple charitable institution. It had been a carefully crafted facade, one that had hidden something far darker beneath the surface. Peter, too, had been shocked by the findings. He had worked at the orphanage for just a short while before its sudden closure, but even during that brief time he had noticed things that didn't sit right. At first they had seemed like small, inconsequential oddities. The sudden disappearances of certain children, the strange meetings held by the higher-ups in the orphanage, the sense that something was off, even though no one talked about it openly. But now, as he and Caroline reviewed the records together, it became painfully clear that these weren't just isolated incidents. Something had been systematically covered up. Caroline had thought she knew the orphanage. After all, she had worked there for years, had watched children come and go, had cared for them as if they were her own. But now, with each new page she turned, she realized that she had been living a lie. The children she had so carefully tended to had not been the innocent wards of a benevolent institution. They had been pawns in a much larger, more sinister scheme. Names of children who had vanished without explanation, others who had been removed from the records entirely, and cryptic notes scribbled in margins all pointed to something that made her stomach churn. The question that haunted Caroline as she looked at the records was not just why the orphanage had been shut down, but what had really been happening behind those walls in the years before. But even more terrifying were the connections Caroline and Peter were starting to piece together. The names in the records weren't just random. Many of them were tied to local figures, wealthy families, influential members of the community, and even local politicians. The more they dug into these names, the more it became clear that the orphanage was not just a place for abandoned children. It had been a front, a cover for something much darker. Caroline and Peter realized they were staring at a vast network of power and corruption, one that stretched far beyond the orphanage's walls and into the highest echelons of local society. At first, the pieces of this web were hard to make out. The records were incomplete, filled with gaps and inconsistencies. Some names appeared in odd places as if they had been inserted after the fact, while others had been deliberately erased from the pages altogether. There were mentions of meetings held under the cover of night, and references to large sums of money changing hands. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to keep the truth buried. But there was one thing that stood out above all else: the children who had disappeared. They were more than just names on a page. They were real people with families, lives, and futures that had been stolen from them. Some had been sent to foster homes, others to institutions, but many had simply vanished. Caroline and Peter scoured the records, looking for any mention of where these children had gone. They found nothing. The trail went cold. It was at this point that Caroline and Peter made a decision. They had to dig deeper, much deeper. If they were ever going to uncover the truth, they would need to speak to those who had been there at the very beginning, the founders of the orphanage. These were the people who had created the institution, the ones who had started the entire operation. Surely they would have answers. But the more they searched for information about the founders, the more they hit dead ends. The names they had found in the records weren't just connected to the orphanage, they were connected to something much larger, something far more dangerous. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized that the orphanage's closure was not a simple matter of financial ruin or mismanagement. There was something much darker at play, something that had been carefully orchestrated, planned, and hidden from the public eye for years. Caroline and Peter began to piece together a terrifying theory. The orphanage had not been a place for orphan children at all. It had been a place for something much more sinister, a breeding ground for secrets, for power, and for manipulation. The children had not just been abandoned, they had been used, exploited in ways that were too dark to comprehend. And what was even more disturbing was the realization that the network behind the orphanage's operations was not just local. It extended far beyond the borders of the town, reaching into the farthest corners of the country. There were people involved in this conspiracy, people with power, influence, and money, who would go to any lengths to ensure that the truth remained buried. Caroline and Peter realized they were not just uncovering a local scandal, they were uncovering a national web of corruption that had been operating in the shadows for decades. As the investigation continued, the fear set in. It wasn't just the fear of what they might uncover, it was the fear of what might happen if they did uncover it. Caroline had worked at the orphanage for years, and she had always thought of it as a safe place. But now she realized it had been nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. The children who had come there, who had placed their trust in the system, had been betrayed. Their lives had been manipulated, their futures destroyed. And the people responsible had done everything in their power to cover their tracks, to erase the evidence, to keep the truth hidden for as long as possible. As they delved deeper into the investigation, the pressure began to mount. They were being watched, followed. Their phones were tapped, their movements tracked. It became clear that someone or something didn't want them to uncover the truth. And yet, despite the growing danger, Caroline and Peter pressed on. They were determined to see this through, to uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. But with each passing day, the investigation became more perilous. They were walking a dangerous line, and it was only a matter of time before someone made their move to silence them. The fear of what they might uncover was now replaced by the fear of what would happen if they didn't stop. The weight of the conspiracy grew heavier with every new revelation, every new piece of evidence that surfaced. And still, the most terrifying question remained: what had really happened to the children? Where had they gone, and why had they been taken in the first place? As Caroline and Peter neared the heart of the mystery, they began to realize that the answers they sought were not just buried in the past. They were buried in a network of lies and deception that stretched far beyond the orphanage's walls. And the closer they got to the truth, the more they understood that it was something they might not be able to survive uncovering. The deeper Caroline and Peter delved into the mystery of the orphanage, the more the web of secrets seemed to tighten around them. Each discovery only led to more questions, and with each step forward, the consequences of their investigation became more and more apparent. The town, once so familiar, now felt like a maze of shadows and whispers, a place where no one could be trusted, where the truth was something that had been buried so deep that finding it felt like digging into the very bones of the earth itself. As they continued their research, the weight of the conspiracy began to take its toll. The pressure was mounting, not just from the people they were uncovering but from the very fabric of the town itself. The more they unearthed, the more they realized that the entire community had been complicit, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in the cover-up. The people who had worked at the orphanage, the local politicians, the wealthy families whose names appeared in the records, they were all part of something larger than anyone had ever imagined. The institution had not simply been a place for orphan children. It had been a breeding ground for secrets, for power, and for control. But as Caroline and Peter continued to piece the puzzle together, they also started to feel the walls closing in around them. It was clear that someone didn't want them digging any deeper. The threats had started small at first. Anonymous phone calls, strange figures lurking outside their windows, but soon they escalated. One night, Caroline returned home to find her front door slightly ajar, the faint smell of cigar smoke in the air. She hadn't been gone long, but the sense of intrusion was unmistakable. It wasn't just the house that felt violated, it was her sense of safety, her belief that she could keep going without consequence. But it wasn't just her home that had been targeted. Peter, too, had begun to feel the pressure. His car had been tampered with, his emails intercepted. Someone was watching them, making sure they understood the stakes of their investigation. Despite the mounting danger, they refused to stop. Every time they uncovered a new piece of evidence, it was like a spark of hope. Every lead they followed, no matter how dangerous, brought them closer to understanding what had really happened. But the more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. One evening, after a long day of digging through old documents and speaking with former staff members, Caroline and Peter sat down together, exhausted but resolute. They had just come across something chilling, a series of letters dated just days before the orphanage's closure, that seemed to hint at a darker purpose behind the institution's abrupt shutdown. These letters, written by a former board member, contained veiled references to shutting down the operation and disposing of the unwanted elements. The language was cryptic, but the implications were clear. The orphanage had been more than just a place for children. It had been a front for something far more sinister, a way to hide away individuals or perhaps even children who were seen as expendable. These letters, along with the other records they had uncovered, painted a picture of an institution that had been systematically manipulating and controlling the lives of its residents. And then there were the children, those who had disappeared, those whose names were no longer on any list. What had happened to them? Were they still alive? Caroline's mind raced as she reviewed the documents. There were mentions of strange disappearances, children who had been transferred to other locations, but no records existed to confirm where they had gone. They had been erased, wiped from history as though they had never existed at all. Caroline felt a sickening sense of dread wash over her. The orphanage hadn't just been hiding its dark dealings. It had been erasing children, removing them from existence as though they had never been born. The thought that so many children could have been lost, their lives stolen without a trace, was unbearable. And yet, this was the truth they were uncovering, bit by bit, layer by layer. The deeper they got, the more they began to question whether they were safe at all. They had been warned. Caroline had received an anonymous message that read simply, "Stop digging or you'll be next." At first, she had thought it was just an empty threat, but as the investigation progressed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was very real. Peter, too, had received a warning, a phone call in the middle of the night, a voice on the other end that simply said, "You don't know who you're messing with." Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare them, they were trying to silence them. They had been watching, waiting for the right moment to make their move. But even as the fear began to creep in, Caroline and Peter couldn't back down. They knew they were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that would shake the very foundations of their town. The truth was just within reach, and they weren't about to let fear stop them now. One night, after hours of sifting through more old records, they stumbled upon something they hadn't expected. A ledger hidden among the other papers containing detailed accounts of financial transactions that seemed to have no business being in an orphanage's records. The transactions were large sums of money, payments made to shell companies, mysterious accounts that didn't seem to belong to anyone in the town. As Caroline carefully studied the ledger, she realized that the orphanage wasn't just hiding children, it was laundering money. The orphanage had been a front for a much larger operation, one that was built on secrecy, deceit, and manipulation. The money wasn't just coming from donors or local charities, it was flowing from illegal activities, from sources that had no business being involved with a charitable institution. The discovery hit them like a punch to the gut. The orphanage had been a cover for something far more complex and insidious than they had ever imagined. The money was flowing through the orphanage's books, being funneled through a network of offshore accounts and hidden transactions. It was clear now that the children were not the only ones who had been exploited. The institution itself had been a key part of a money laundering operation, one that involved powerful people who had worked hard to keep their involvement hidden. As Caroline and Peter pieced this together, they realized that the stakes had grown exponentially. The people involved in this operation were not just local figures, they were part of a global network, a web of corruption that extended far beyond their town. The orphanage had been a small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that spanned continents and connected the most powerful people in the world. The danger they were facing now wasn't just local, it was international, and it was far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. Caroline couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over her. They had been so close to the truth, but now that they understood the full scope of the conspiracy, they realized just how much danger they were in. The people behind the orphanage's operations would do anything to protect their secrets, to keep the truth from coming to light. And now, as Caroline and Peter realized, the investigation wasn't just about uncovering the fate of the children, it was about exposing a global network of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and Caroline and Peter were determined to find it, no matter the cost. As they stared at the ledger, their minds racing with the implications, they knew that this was no longer just a local mystery, it was a global scandal, one that would shake the very foundations of power. And as the danger continued to close in around them, they knew that the only way out was to expose the truth, no matter what it cost them. The air around Caroline and Peter had grown thick with tension. As they continued to unravel the threads of corruption surrounding the orphanage, they felt the weight of the world pressing down on them. It was no longer just an investigation into an abandoned institution. It had evolved into something much larger, more dangerous, and far more complex than they could have imagined. The deeper they dug, the more they realized the stakes had escalated. They were no longer dealing with local figures or a few shady characters. What they were uncovering had the potential to bring down powerful global networks, to expose a system that had operated in the shadows for decades, perhaps even centuries. The money laundering schemes were just the beginning. The ledger they had discovered, filled with large sums of untraceable money, was only one piece of the puzzle. What they were seeing now, what they were beginning to understand, was that the orphanage had been far more than a simple institution for orphan children. It had been part of a sprawling, shadowy network of individuals, organizations, and businesses whose sole purpose was to exploit the most vulnerable for profit and power. Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the more she learned, the more she was slipping into a world of darkness from which there would be no return. She had always believed in justice, in the idea that people who did wrong should be held accountable. But now, as she and Peter pieced together the reality of the orphanage's role in this web of corruption, she began to question everything she had once believed in. Who could she trust? Who would believe them once they exposed the truth? And even more pressing, what would happen to them if they did? The further they ventured into this labyrinth, the more they realized they were surrounded by unseen forces, and the closer they got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more dangerous it became. Peter too had felt the creeping dread. The strange phone calls, the surveillance, the unexplained accidents, all of it had begun to take its toll. But despite the fear, they couldn't turn back. They had crossed a line and there was no going back now. The children who had been lost in the system, the ones whose names had been erased, deserved justice. They deserved to have their stories told. And if Caroline and Peter could uncover the truth, perhaps they could expose the system that had taken those children from the world, hidden them away and forgotten them. But the question remained, who were they really up against? One night, as Caroline sat in her dimly lit apartment, going through more documents, she found something that sent a cold chill through her entire body. It was a letter tucked into the back of a folder that had been deliberately hidden from the rest of the records. The letter was from a private investigator, someone who had been hired by the orphanage years before its closure. The contents were chilling. The investigator had been hired to find out what had happened to several children who had disappeared without a trace. The letter was a report, detailing the investigator's findings, but it ended abruptly. The last paragraph read, "I have uncovered information that suggests the involvement of high-profile individuals, including members of government. I have been warned to stop investigating, but I will not. I will send my final report shortly." Caroline's heart pounded as she read the last words. The letter was dated just a few months before the orphanage had been shut down. The investigator had been getting too close to something that had involved people in positions of immense power. The very people they had been uncovering in their investigation. The letter was a direct link to the truth, to the hidden machinations that had made the orphanage a pawn in a much larger game. But the letter also raised more questions. If the investigator had been silenced, if they had been shut down before they could expose the truth, who had done it? And why? It was clear that the people behind the orphanage weren't just involved in illegal activities, they were part of a larger network, one that had the power to destroy lives, to manipulate the system, to keep secrets buried under layers of lies and fear. And if the private investigator had been silenced, who was to say Caroline and Peter wouldn't be next? Peter had been doing his own research, following up on the names that kept cropping up in the records. He had tracked down a few individuals connected to the orphanage, a few people who had worked there, some who had been donors, others who had been involved in the financial dealings that had kept the institution running for so many years. Some of them were still living in the town, others had moved away, but all of them had connections that seemed to lead back to the orphanage in one way or another. One person in particular, a former board member of the orphanage, had raised Peter's suspicions. This man, a wealthy businessman who had once been one of the orphanage's largest benefactors, had mysteriously disappeared around the same time the orphanage closed. No one had ever talked about him and his name was barely mentioned in the records. But after a few phone calls and a bit of digging, Peter had found something unsettling. The businessman had connections to several offshore companies, and some of those companies appeared to be linked to organizations that had been under investigation for human trafficking and money laundering. It was as though this man had been a key player in the network that had used the orphanage to funnel illegal activity. With this new lead in hand, Caroline and Peter set out to find the former board member. They weren't sure what they would find, but they had to know more. The closer they got to him, the more they realized that they were walking into dangerous territory. The man had become a ghost. No one had seen him in years, and his business dealings had been shrouded in secrecy. But Caroline and Peter were determined. They had to find him. He was the missing link, the person who could help them understand the full scope of the conspiracy and, hopefully, lead them to the truth. It wasn't easy. Their search took them far from their small town, to hidden locations where no one seemed to know anything about the man. They visited empty houses, interviewed former colleagues who spoke in hushed tones, and dug through old records, all the while feeling the eyes of the unseen world upon them. But each dead end only pushed them forward. They couldn't stop now. They were too close. Finally, after weeks of searching, they found someone who had worked with the businessman many years ago. A former associate, now living in a remote part of the country, agreed to meet them, albeit with a warning. "You're digging into something dangerous," he told them. "You don't know who you're messing with. People like him, they don't disappear without reason. And neither do the children." The word sent a chill through Caroline's spine. What had they stumbled upon? Who was behind all of this? And why were they willing to go to such lengths to keep the truth from coming out? As they listened to the man's story, they learned that the businessman had been a key player in a network that spanned multiple continents. He had used the orphanage as a front for a human trafficking ring, exploiting vulnerable children, siphoning off money, and laundering illegal funds. It wasn't just the orphanage that had been involved, It was part of something much larger, a machine that had operated in the shadows for decades, moving people, money, and power across borders with impunity. But the most disturbing part of the story came last. The former associate explained that the businessman had been involved in something much darker than they could ever imagine. The children who had disappeared from the orphanage, the ones who had been erased from the records, had been sold. Their lives had been stolen and sold to the highest bidder. And the people behind the orphanage had made a fortune doing it. Caroline and Peter sat in stunned silence as the truth began to settle in. The orphanage had been nothing more than a smokescreen, a way to hide the trafficking operation that had been going on for years. And the children they had spent so long investigating, the ones who had vanished without a trace, had been victims in the worst possible way. The realization hit Caroline and Peter with a force they hadn't prepared for. Everything they thought they knew about the orphanage had been shattered in an instant. The children they had believed were merely abandoned, lost in the system, were instead the victims of a monstrous network that had been operating under their very noses. The orphanage had been a front, a decoy, designed to conceal one of the darkest, most insidious operations they could have ever imagined. They had been investigating the wrong questions, chasing ghosts of bureaucratic failure when in reality, they had been uncovering something far more depraved. The former associate's words echoed in Caroline's mind, his revelation sinking in deeper with each passing second. The businessman they had been chasing, the key figure behind the orphanage, had been at the helm of a global trafficking ring. Children had been taken from the orphanage, erased from the records, and sold to the highest bidder. The enormity of the operation was staggering. They had unknowingly uncovered a human trafficking syndicate that spanned multiple countries, with powerful individuals, some of whom were in positions of governmental power, protecting it. The orphanage had been the perfect cover, its innocent mission cloaking the exploitation happening behind the scenes. Caroline could barely keep up with the revelations. She had thought they were just looking for answers about the orphanage's closure, but now she understood that their search had led them into the heart of a much larger, more dangerous conspiracy. The very people they had once trusted, those who had worked at the orphanage, those who had held positions of authority, had been complicit in these horrific crimes. But the truly horrifying realization was that the children who had disappeared, whose names had been erased from the official records, had been nothing more than commodities in a global trade. The magnitude of what they were facing left Caroline numb. She had seen plenty of darkness in her life, had witnessed human suffering in ways that had left permanent scars. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. The kids she had cared for, the ones who had laughed and cried in the orphanage's halls, had been torn from their lives and sold to people who had no regard for their innocence, their lives, or their futures. They had been nothing but pawns in a game of money, power, and control.